December 1776. The American Revolution was dying a slow, agonizing death. British and Hessian forces controlled most of New Jersey. Congress had fled Philadelphia in panic, and George Washington's Continental Army was dissolving before his eyes like salt in rain. Enlistments were expiring, soldiers were deserting by the hundreds every day, and even the most dedicated patriots were beginning to whisper about the unthinkable: surrender. In 10 days, when the year ended and enlistments expired, the rebellion would be over. But Washington had one final card to play, a desperate gamble that would either save the revolution or destroy it completely, ending the dream of American independence forever. The situation in late December was nothing short of catastrophic. British posts stretched across eastern New Jersey like a chain of iron, with enemy ships patrolling the Delaware River near Philadelphia. Panic gripped the colonial capital as rumors spread of British warships in the bay, preparing for a final assault that would crush the rebellion once and for all. Wealthy residents were fleeing with their valuables, loading wagons with everything they could carry, while abandoning homes that had sheltered their families for generations. The Continental Congress was preparing to abandon the city entirely, acknowledging what everyone already knew: the great experiment in self-governance was failing spectacularly. Representatives who had signed the Declaration of Independence just months earlier now faced the very real possibility that their names would be remembered only as signatures on a failed document, their lives forfeit to British justice as soon as the rebellion collapsed. Samuel Adams, the firebrand revolutionary who had pushed harder than anyone for independence, now faced the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. In Congress, voices of despair grew louder each day, echoing through meeting halls where delegates had once spoken boldly of liberty and self-determination. Some representatives openly suggested it was time to seek terms with the British before complete annihilation made even negotiated surrender impossible. The cause that had seemed so righteous in July, when independence was declared amid celebration and hope, now appeared to be nothing more than the delusion of desperate men who had overestimated their ability to challenge the British Empire. On December 11th, Congress made a decision that revealed their utter desperation and marked perhaps the lowest point in American history. They voted to adjourn and flee to Baltimore, effectively abandoning the revolution's capital to the enemy. It was an admission that the great experiment in liberty was failing, that the dream of independence had become a nightmare of military defeat, political collapse, and the very real possibility that the leaders of the rebellion would end their lives on British gallows. But even as Congress fled like leaves before a hurricane, they granted Washington something unprecedented in American governance: near dictatorial powers. For 6 months, he would have authority to act without congressional oversight, to make military decisions that could determine the fate of the entire continent. It was a desperate measure from desperate men, an acknowledgement that only extraordinary leadership could save a cause that appeared beyond salvation. The British, meanwhile, were preparing for final victory with the methodical precision that had built their global empire. General William Howe had established winter quarters across New Jersey, confident that spring would bring the formal end of the rebellion and the restoration of British authority across the colonies. His forces controlled key positions from New York to Philadelphia, creating a network of strongholds that seemed impregnable to any force the Americans could muster. Hessian mercenaries, professional soldiers who had fought across Europe's bloodiest battlefields, were stationed in comfortable towns like Trenton, Princeton, and Bordenton. These weren't militia farmers or colonial volunteers. They were elite troops who had conquered enemies from London to Frankfurt, soldiers whose very presence on American soil represented the empire's determination to crush the rebellion with overwhelming force. Their uniforms were pristine, their weapons were the finest European manufacturers could provide, and their training was the product of generations of German military excellence.
Colonel Johann Rall commanded the Hessian garrison at Trenton with the confidence of a man who had never lost a battle. His 1,000 soldiers were the cream of German military might, disciplined professionals who viewed the Continental Army as little more than armed peasants playing at war. When local civilians warned of possible American attacks, Rall dismissed such concerns with the contempt that professional soldiers reserve for amateur opponents. What could Washington's ragged survivors accomplish against veteran European soldiers who had carved their reputation on battlefields across 2 continents? That contempt would prove fatal, but it was entirely understandable given what Rall and his men had witnessed. The Continental Army that had retreated across New Jersey bore little resemblance to a professional fighting force. Soldiers marched without proper uniforms, many lacking shoes adequate for winter campaigning. Their weapons were a mixture of hunting rifles, captured British muskets, and whatever firearms they could acquire from colonial gunsmiths. Their discipline, while improving under Washington's leadership, still fell short of European standards that had been refined through centuries of warfare. Washington's army had been reduced to fewer than 6,000 men, and even those numbers were misleading. Hundreds would complete their enlistments on December 31st, just days away. These weren't career soldiers bound by military law and professional obligations. They were volunteers who could simply walk away when their service ended, returning to farms and workshops without any legal consequence for abandoning the cause. Unless something dramatic happened immediately, something that would inspire them to continue fighting despite months of defeat and hardship, the Continental Army would cease to exist within a week. The general faced an impossible choice that would define not only his career, but the future of American independence. He could retreat further, perhaps trying to preserve what remained of his force through the winter months, hoping that spring might bring French alliance or some other miraculous change in circumstances. He could negotiate surrender terms that might spare his men's lives, and perhaps his own, acknowledging that the rebellion had failed, but preventing the complete destruction of the colonial forces. Or he could attempt something so audacious that even his closest advisors thought it bordered on madness: attack professional enemy soldiers in the middle of winter, during the worst weather of the year, with an army that was barely holding together. Washington chose madness, but it was the calculated madness of a leader who understood that conventional wisdom had already failed. Every textbook rule of warfare suggested that armies didn't campaign in winter, that amateur soldiers couldn't defeat professionals, that desperate circumstances called for cautious measures. Washington was about to prove that revolutionary wars required revolutionary thinking. Christmas Day, 1776, brought one of the most severe winter storms in living memory. Ice choked the Delaware River, transforming it from a waterway into a frozen obstacle course. Snow fell in blinding sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards, while temperatures plummeted well below freezing. Wind howled across the Pennsylvania countryside with the fury of nature unleashed, creating conditions that made any outdoor activity dangerous and military operations seemingly impossible. It was exactly the kind of weather that made military movement unthinkable, which is precisely why Washington chose it for his attack. At sunset on Christmas evening, Continental soldiers began gathering at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles above Trenton. These men had already endured months of defeat and retreat, following their commander across New Jersey in what appeared to be an endless series of withdrawals. They were poorly clothed, inadequately fed, and exhausted from constant marching over roads that turned to mud under their feet. Many left bloody footprints in the snow because they lacked proper shoes, their feet wrapped in rags that provided minimal protection against the frozen ground. But they followed Washington to the riverbank because they trusted him with something more precious than their lives: their hope for freedom. The crossing began as darkness fell over the ice-choked Delaware. 18-foot Durham boats, normally used for hauling iron ore down the river, became troop transports for an army attempting the impossible. These vessels, designed for cargo rather than military operations, had to be loaded with soldiers, weapons, ammunition, and artillery pieces, while ice floes turned the Delaware into a maze of floating obstacles. Driving sleet made visibility zero, forcing boat crews to navigate by instinct and experience rather than sight. Washington himself supervised the operation, standing in the lead boat as his soldiers fought the current and ice. This wasn't symbolic leadership designed to inspire the troops. It was practical necessity born of desperate circumstances. If the commanding general was willing to risk drowning in an ice-filled river, if he was prepared to share every danger his men faced, then those men would follow him anywhere. The image of Washington crossing the Delaware would become iconic in American memory, but the reality was even more remarkable than the legend. A general who led from the front when everything depended on personal example.
The crossing took longer than planned, stretching through the entire night as boat after boat fought its way across the treacherous river. What should have been a 3-hour operation became an epic of endurance that tested every man's commitment to the cause. Soldiers who had already demonstrated their dedication by serving through months of defeat now proved their courage by trusting their lives to unstable boats on a river that could kill them as surely as any British bullet. The storm that made the crossing so treacherous also provided perfect cover, ensuring that no enemy scouts would detect the massive movement of troops across the river. Hessian patrols, like any sensible soldiers, had taken shelter from weather that made visibility impossible and movement dangerous. They could not imagine that any army would attempt to cross a major river in such conditions, much less march 9 miles through a blizzard to launch an attack. Their very reasonableness became their weakness as Washington's desperate gamble exploited the gap between professional military thinking and revolutionary necessity. By 4 a.m, 2,400 Continental soldiers stood on New Jersey soil, soaked to the skin and freezing, but ready to march. The original plan had called for 3 separate crossings, with other divisions attacking Princeton and Bordentown simultaneously in a coordinated assault that would shatter British control of central New Jersey. But only Washington's force had managed to cross in the horrific weather conditions that defeated even the most dedicated attempts. Instead of the coordinated assault they had planned, they would face the enemy alone, with no support and no possibility of retreat if the attack failed. The 9-mile march to Trenton became an epic of endurance that would be remembered as long as Americans valued liberty. Soldiers struggled through knee-deep snow while sleet cut their faces like razor blades, each step a conscious choice to continue fighting for independence despite conditions that would have broken lesser men. 2 soldiers actually froze to death during the march, their bodies left behind as grim reminders of the stakes involved. But the army pressed on because they understood that this was their last chance to prove that liberty was worth dying for, that the cause they had served through months of defeat could still triumph if they found the courage to attempt the impossible. Washington divided his force into 2 columns as they approached Trenton, implementing a tactical plan that would maximize their chances of success while minimizing the enemy's ability to escape. One group, led by General Nathaniel Greene, would attack from the north, advancing down the Princeton Road to cut off any retreat in that direction. The other column, commanded by General John Sullivan, would strike from the west, approaching along the River Road to prevent the Hessians from fleeing toward British positions downriver. It was a pincer movement designed to trap the garrison inside the town, preventing their escape and maximizing both the tactical victory and the psychological impact that success would have on American morale. The Hessians in Trenton were experiencing their own kind of Christmas, one that would contrast dramatically with the harsh conditions their enemies had endured. Professional soldiers stationed in a comfortable American town, they had celebrated the holiday with the confidence of men who believed the war was essentially over.
Their quarters were warm, their meals were substantial, and their duties were light. Colonel Rahl himself had spent Christmas evening playing cards and drinking, dismissing reports of American patrols as the desperate movements of a beaten enemy whose only remaining option was harassment rather than serious military action. This fatal overconfidence was about to meet American desperation in a collision that would change the course of history. The professional soldiers who had conquered enemies across Europe were about to learn that revolutionary wars operated by different rules, that desperate men fighting for their freedom could accomplish things that violated every principle of conventional military wisdom. At 8 o'clock in the morning of December 26th, Continental soldiers emerged from the storm like vengeful spirits materializing from another world. Hessian sentries, struggling to see through the driving snow, suddenly found themselves facing an enemy army that wasn't supposed to exist, led by a general who wasn't supposed to attack, carrying out an operation that wasn't supposed to be possible. The professional soldiers who had conquered half of Europe were caught completely off guard by farmers and shopkeepers who marched through a blizzard to attack them. The battle for Trenton lasted exactly 45 minutes, but in that brief span, everything changed. Not just the tactical situation in New Jersey, not just the immediate prospects for American independence, but the entire character of the war itself was transformed by what happened in those crucial moments when desperate Americans proved that liberty could triumph over professional military might. Colonel Rahl attempted to organize a defense, but his men were scattered throughout the town in winter quarters that had been chosen for comfort rather than tactical advantage. As American artillery, commanded by Alexander Hamilton and other young officers, poured fire into the streets, Hessian soldiers stumbled from warm buildings into chaos that no amount of European training had prepared them to handle. Their military discipline, so effective in European battlefields where armies faced each other across open ground according to established rules, meant nothing when facing an enemy that attacked during impossible weather from unexpected directions. Sullivan's men seized the southern bridge, cutting off the most obvious retreat route and trapping the Hessian garrison inside the town. Greene's force controlled the northern approaches, completing the encirclement that would prevent any organized withdrawal. Hessian attempts to deploy their artillery were frustrated by American marksmen who picked off gunners with deadly accuracy, proving that months of retreat had taught the Continental Army valuable lessons about unconventional warfare. These weren't the undisciplined militiamen that European generals expected to face when campaigning in the colonies. They were soldiers who had learned to fight a different kind of war, one that emphasized adaptability over rigid formation, initiative over blind obedience to orders, and tactical flexibility over adherence to European military doctrine. The defeats they had suffered across New Jersey had been painful, but they had also been educational, teaching Washington's army how to fight in ways that European professionals couldn't anticipate or counter. Colonel Rahl, desperately trying to rally his men and organize some kind of effective resistance, was struck by American fire and mortally wounded. With their commander down and their positions overrun by enemies they had dismissed as amateurs, Hessian resistance collapsed like a house built on sand. Within an hour of the attack's beginning, 900 professional soldiers were laying down their arms in surrender to an army they had dismissed as rabble.
The numbers tell only part of the story of what happened at Trenton. The Continental Army suffered 2 wounded and 0 dead while capturing nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers along with their weapons, supplies, and artillery. But the real victory was psychological. A transformation of American confidence that would prove more valuable than any material gains. Professional European soldiers had surrendered to American farmers, proving that the Continental Army could defeat anyone when properly led and motivated by the cause of liberty.
News of Trenton spread across the colonies like wildfire, carried by riders who understood that they were spreading more than information about a single battle. In taverns and churches, on farms and in workshops, Americans who had begun to despair suddenly found reason to hope again. The army that had retreated across New Jersey in apparent defeat had returned to deliver a victory that proved the revolution was far from over, that independence remained achievable if Americans were willing to fight for it. Recruitment, which had nearly ceased as defeat followed defeat, suddenly surged beyond anyone's expectations. Men who had completed their enlistments chose to re-enlist, inspired by proof that their sacrifices could lead to victory. Militia units that had disbanded reformed with new volunteers eager to serve alongside the army that had shocked the world by defeating professional European soldiers. The revolution that had seemed ready to collapse was reborn in the space of a single morning, transformed from a failing rebellion into a viable war for independence. European observers took notice as well, recognizing that the strategic situation in North America had changed fundamentally. French diplomats, who had been cautious about supporting what appeared to be a lost cause, began serious discussions about alliance with rebels who had proven they could defeat professional military forces. The colonists who had surprised professional soldiers at Trenton might be worthy partners in France's ongoing struggle against British global dominance. But perhaps most importantly, the victory at Trenton proved something crucial to the soldiers themselves. They had crossed an ice-filled river in a blizzard, marched 9 miles through snow that would have stopped any reasonable army, and defeated professional European troops in their own stronghold. They were no longer an amateur army hoping to avoid complete defeat. They were a force capable of imposing their will on any enemy, regardless of reputation or professional training. The general understood the full significance of what they had accomplished. In a single operation, they had transformed the character of the entire war. The British could no longer assume that winter weather would protect their positions or that American forces were incapable of sustained offensive operations. Hessian mercenaries could no longer dismiss American soldiers as ineffective militia who would flee at the first sight of professional troops. Most importantly, Americans themselves could no longer doubt that independence was achievable if they were willing to pay the price in blood and sacrifice. The general's decision to risk everything on a Christmas night crossing had saved the revolution, but it had done something more profound than merely preventing defeat. It had created a new understanding of what American soldiers could accomplish when fighting for something greater than themselves, when motivated by principles that transcended personal safety or conventional military wisdom. The army that recrossed the Delaware on December 26th was fundamentally different from the force that had retreated across New Jersey just weeks earlier. They had discovered that they could endure what professional soldiers could not, that fighting for liberty gave them advantages that no European army possessed. Most importantly, they had proven that Americans willing to sacrifice everything for freedom were capable of achieving the impossible. Trenton became more than a battle. It became proof that a new kind of nation was being born. The soldiers who fought there weren't just winning a war. They were demonstrating that ordinary people could create extraordinary outcomes when united by revolutionary ideals. That lesson would define American military doctrine for generations to come, influencing everything from the Civil War to World War II. The crossing of the Delaware and the victory at Trenton saved the American Revolution, but they did something more profound that would echo through American history for centuries. They proved that the greatest military victories come not from superior numbers or better equipment, but from soldiers who understand exactly what they're fighting for and are willing to risk everything to achieve it. In 45 minutes of combat on a frozen morning in New Jersey, the United States of America was truly born.